Welcome back to another episode of Physiology 2, especially for you. In this video, it's about exercise and exercise physiology. First, just an intro because the real exercise physiology is going to be covered in future physiology courses. But in this video, we will try to capture the summary and the application of all the basic principles that we taught you earlier. So all the normal physiology is now going to be applied to exercise in order to really see if you all have the full understanding and an idea of the practical implications in exercise and in training. All right. So before we move on, we have to separate those two terms. So right here, you can see the word exercise and here the word training. In plain English, very often, these terms are mixed up. And sometimes people use one over the other without the real difference in the idea or the meaning of those words. In this video, in this course, and also in future courses, we try to be very careful in order to separate the exercise versus training. So exercise in this video especially is all about the instant effects of exercise on the physiological parameters. For example, if your heart rate during exercise right now is higher than compared to rest, then that is the effect of exercise. So the instant physiological effect. Training, on the contrary, is actually the consequence of a very systematic set of exercises. So training is about the chronic adaptations that you want to incur over time. So heart rate at rest that is lower after 12 months of training compared to right now, that is an effect of training. So training is about chronic adaptations. Those can be measured physiologically, whereas exercise is, or the effects of exercise are the instant effects. In this video, we will start with a couple of instant effects of exercise compared to rest. Later, we will mix in a couple of the chronic adaptations that you can expect as the consequence of aerobic training. In this table, you can see a couple of variables. I'm not going to go through all of them, but definitely have a good look at the book to see if you can follow the reasoning behind the changes that are indicated right here for all these different variables. To give you an example, for cardiac output, again, compared to rest, you would expect during exercise a higher heart rate and a higher stroke volume, so as a consequence also a higher cardiac output. And that is just due to the fact that, for example, if you're running, compared to rest, you need more energy. If you need more energy, you need more VO2. If you need more VO2, you need more cardiac output. And cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, as you should know by now. So all these variables increase if you compare an exercise situation compared to rest. Also, the total peripheral resistance, for example, goes down in exercise compared to rest. And that is due to a reduction in the resistance inside the skeletal muscles, for example, by having the capillaries widen. So vasodilation is occurring, and that will cause the resistance of the blood flow through the active tissues to go down. Here you can see a few more variables with the indicated increase, whether it's an increase or a decrease. So try to explain all these different variables to see if you have the full understanding. A normal response to, for example, 6 or 8 or 10 minutes of running at a steady pace is a graph something like this. For the heart rate on the y-axis and time, you can imagine, or you could expect actually, for every steady exercise that doesn't change in the actual intensity, that the heart rate will rise and after a few minutes will start to reach its steady level. So if you're biking at a stationary bike, you have set the workload to a fixed number, let's say 150 watts. Then after 2-3 minutes for an average person, you would expect the heart rate to reach its steady level. And then for the remaining minutes of the actual exercise, if the intensity doesn't change, you would expect the heart rate also to not further change. And that is due to the fact that the system needs a few minutes to get started. After those few minutes, the heart rate will match the actual requirement of the intensity. So that's why you would expect the heart rate to reach this so-called steady state value until the exercise is completed. For the VO2, you can expect a similar graph, and in this graph you can see the oxygen uptake, so VO2, in comparison to the amount of time that you spend during the exercise. So the exercise starts at 0 and will finish at 5 minutes later. So then if you are exercising at 50 watts, you would expect the heart rate to rise and then to reach a steady level after 1 or 2 minutes, and then the heart rate will remain, the VO2 will remain on that same steady state value, just as you would expect the heart rate to stay at that same steady value. And then you can see that if the workload increases, so for example 100 watts or 150 watts or 200 watts, that the time that it will take to reach that steady level might increase a little bit, but then for at least the remaining last few minutes of the exercise, you will see that the heart rate for 200 watts is not expected to increase or decrease any further. So you would remain on that steady value. So you would imagine that for a 200 watts exercise, the intensity is higher than for a 150 watts exercise. And that's the reason why the steady heart rate is also higher here and the VO2 is higher here than here. But in both situations, as long as you're looking at submaximal exercise, you will see that the steady state value for both heart rate and VO2 is what you would expect. For the sake of simplicity, please ignore these top values so that we can focus only on the true submaximal conditions. In this graph, you can see the exercise effects plus training effects. So the red graph shows the post-training values, whereas the green graph shows the pre-training values for VO2 in comparison to a certain number of kilometers per hour that someone is running on, say, a treadmill. Before training, the blue line shows that if you have someone run at 6 kilometers per hour, that will correspond to a certain VO2. And if you would have that same person work out on that same steady speed for a couple of minutes, then the required VO2 will rise linearly. So this is a linear rise. So if you exercise for a few minutes at 6 kilometers per hour, or you exercise for a few minutes at 10 kilometers per hour, you could expect a linear increase in VO2. Well, now you see that at some point, if you would try and have someone run gradually at higher speeds, that at some point someone will not be able to continue to run at a certain pace because they have reached their VO2 max. So that's what you can see here at roughly 13 kilometers per hour. You can see that this blue person is actually now reaching his 45 milliliters per kilogram per minute as its VO2 max. After, let's say, 12 weeks or 20 weeks of solid and good aerobic training, the same person is now showing the red graph. And in the red graph, you see that during submaximal intensities, the post versus pre-training values are pretty much the same. If there's any difference in post-training, there would be a slight reduction in the required VO2 per speed, and that is only attributed to a very small increase in efficiency. Maybe running efficiency or physiological efficiency has changed just slightly post-training compared to pre, but in short, it's easy to remember that this is pretty much the same for submaximal conditions. But then you can see that due to this aerobic training program, this person during higher intensities is still able to deliver his VO2, and ultimately you can see here that this same person has actually managed to reach a maximum speed during the maximal exercise test of around 17 in comparison to 13 kilometers per hour, and that is accompanied by a big increase in VO2 max, because right now the value is, let's say, 67 milliliters per kilogram per minute, whereas over here it was only 45 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So you can see here in the red graph, the exercise effects show to be pretty much the same. So during exercise, post-training, or pre-training, the response is almost the same in comparison to the speed that is required for the run. But then you see here that maximum values due to the aerobic training program have increased. Here's a graph of, again, an exercise response. And you can see then a couple of areas that in exercise physiology literature are often referred to. So let me start by explaining again. On the y-axis here, we have the O2 consumption, so the VO2. And the idea is that at rest, you need a certain baseline O2 consumption. If you start exercising, then just like a diesel engine, your aerobic system will get started, but it will require a couple of minutes sometimes, or at least 1 minute to get started and reach the steady level. Now, if you're again exercising or running at a steady pace, you would expect that this is the steady state oxygen consumption that would exactly match the physiological demand in terms of the external workload, again, speed of running or workload when biking. But then here, when the whole diesel engine is still starting to speed up and to reach this steady level, then in literature very often this area is actually designed or assigned as the so-called O2 deficit. It's not really a deficit, but you can imagine that if you would start exercising at a fixed workload, from the first second you would actually require this amount of O2, but the system is just not ready for it. So during the first 2 minutes, you would expect the body to somehow use other resources to fill this deficit. During the remaining minutes of the exercise here, the O2 consumption should exactly match the requirement until the exercise is completed, because then you would expect the VO2 to decline, but it's not a very abrupt decline back to normal. No, what you would expect is that the VO2 will gradually lower, even though you're no longer working out, until you have completed the recovery and your VO2 is back to its resting value. And whereas this area is usually defined as the O2 deficit, this area underneath this curve is considered as the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So it's actually the opposite of what you would expect here. Here you have a shortage, a deficit of O2, whereas here you have excess O2 consumption that is all connected to the recovery and not due to the external workload that's required. Let's have a look at a few normal numbers right now. So if you have a cardiac output of, let's say, 16 liters per minute for a regular submaximal exercise, and the O2 transport is 200 milliliters per liter of blood, then overall it's possible for you to deliver 3.2 liters of O2 per minute. And due to training, after, let's say, again, 20 or 30 weeks of solid aerobic training, this number can be pushed up to this number in maximal exercise. So it can really bring up the O transport to values as high as 8 liters per minute. Please realize that this is only about the transport and not yet about the consumption. As we saw before in one of those graphs, usually you would expect the cardiac output to be in line with the VO2. So also cardiac output max is directly connected to VO2 max. And in this graph, you can nicely see how for sedentary people and for endurance athletes, both values seem to fall almost perfectly onto a linear line that you could draw through these points. So on the vertical axis, you can see the maximal cardiac output, whereas on the horizontal axis, you can see the maximum oxygen consumption. And this is expressed in liters per minute, and this is also expressed in liters per minute. And then you can see that for sedentary people, both max values are relatively low. For endurance athletes, these values are relatively high, but they all fall on this nice linear line. So it shows a almost perfect linear relationship between cardiac output and VO2. All right, so what is then the difference physiologically if we look at the more details between exercise and training? In this graph from Vander, you can see that cardiac output, if we put it on the y-axis versus work rate, which would be the equivalent of the O2 consumption, again show an almost perfect linear relationship for untrained people and also for trained people. And the trained curve is actually right behind the untrained curve, so it's almost a perfect one-to-one connection where you see a linear increase in work rate is accompanied by a linear increase in cardiac output. Again, if you look at untrained versus trained, you see that the maximum cardiac output that someone can reach after training is higher than before this long training program. If we then look at the heart rate, the second graph, you can see heart rate now on the vertical axis and work rate again on the horizontal axis. Now you see that for heart rate, there is a significant difference at any given work rate if we compare trained to untrained. So at any given intensity, that is true for rest, trained values are lower than untrained values. During any submaximal exercise, let's say both people are biking at 150 watts, or especially if you imagine it's the same person biking at 150 watts right now, then the heart rate right now untrained is higher than, let's say, the trained heart rate after 20 weeks. So again, at any given heart rate, any given work rate, so at any given resistance on the bike, at any given speed while running, you would expect the heart rate for trained people to be lower than for untrained people. At maximum intensities, you can see that maximum values are not different. So maximum heart rate is not affected by training. It's affected by genetics, we will see later, and by aging, but not by training. So you would expect pretty much the exact same maximum heart rate, only for trained people that can be reached at higher work rates, so at a higher workload on a stationary bike, for example. So what explains the difference in heart rate? Because cardiac output was the same, heart rate was lower, well, then it must be explained by a difference in stroke volume. And that's what you can see in this graph. So again, work rate or oxygen consumption on the x-axis, but now stroke volume on the y-axis. And this shows that the trained stroke volume values are always higher than untrained stroke volume values. That is true at rest, that is true at submaximal intensities, and that is true at maximum intensities. And due to training, the heart has grown, the muscles or the heart muscle has become stronger, so stroke volume could be higher at any given intensity, and that is simply the reason why the heart rate at rest and submaximal intensities can simply be lower, because there's no need for the heart to pump as fast anymore, because if stroke volume is higher and you only need the same cardiac output, you can deliver this with a lower heart rate. I mentioned it already briefly. The maximum heart rate is not affected by training, but mainly determined by genetics. So if you compare one person to the other, the only way to make a reasonable comparison is by looking at their age. And then still with this age prediction, you have to realize that it is only a prediction, and that means you're always wrong in predicting someone's maximum heart rate with the age prediction model. So I would always recommend, therefore, if possible, to do a maximal exercise test to find out someone's true maximum heart rate. For one person, though, you can expect definitely the heart rate to get lower by aging. So roughly 1 beat per year is what you can expect the heart rate at maximum intensities to go down every year. So if you compare one person right now and again in 20 years from now, then it's very reasonable to imagine that the maximum heart rate is actually now 20 beats lower than 20 years ago. Here again, you can see a graph with the heart rate in comparison to treadmill speed. So if this is one person that is gradually being increased in the treadmill speed that he's running at, you can see again a pretty much linear increase in the heart rate to accompany that intensity increase until you reach your maximum speed on the treadmill, which is caused also by the maximum heart rate to be reached. So this is an example of a proper max test if you just look at the heart rate, because a small increase in running intensity in the end did not further increase the heart rate max, which means that you've most likely reached someone's true maximum heart rate. In this graph, you can see again the exercise effects in combination with training effects. And now in a little bit more detail than the previous graphs about stroke volume, where you see again the milliliters per beat displayed on the y-axis, and on the horizontal axis you can see the treadmill speed. So if you compare someone pre and post training, so pre-training would be the blue line, let's say today. The red line would be the values after 20 weeks of an aerobic training program. For the same activity, for the same speed, you would expect the pre-training stroke volume values always to be lower than post-training values. But here, a linear increase, both pre-training and post-training. Whereas again, for the post-training situation, the maximum values are both higher for the treadmill speed during a maximal exercise test and the actual maximum stroke volume. So you can see here values that are over 150 beats per minute, milliliters per beat, whereas the pre-training values maxed at, let's say, 110. So there's really a significant increase in stroke volume as a training effect as a result of the training program. If you look at stroke volume, then you can see here for any given heart rate, another example in cyclists of how stroke volume can increase due to training. And here for these untrained people, you can see that even an increase in the intensity measured by an increase in heart rate did not really push the stroke volume up as much as for the trained person. So here you can see really the training effect in these cyclists compared to untrained people, where the stroke volume was able to increase even until values that are above 180 milliliters per beat, whereas for the untrained person, these values did not get higher than 125, maybe max 130. Stroke volume is also affected by body position, mainly due to gravity. So that's the reason why these graphs are put side by side. So here you can see a certain amount of workload, rest, low, intermediate, and peak in an upright position versus a supine position. So what you can see is that the end diastolic values right here, for example at rest, are higher than during upright positions. And that is mainly due to gravity and the venous return that is the consequence of having gravity not work against you in supine positions. So that makes it a lot easier for the body to have more venous return. And then due to the Frank Starling mechanism, as I'm sure you know by now, you will expect a higher end diastolic volume and as a consequence also a higher stroke volume. So here you can see the end systolic volume is not so different if you compare supine rest versus upright rest, but you do see a difference in stroke volume that is attributed to an increased filling. And that difference stays if you look at low, intermediate, or even peak exercises, where the end diastolic volume is simply higher in supine positions compared to upright positions. Why is this important? Well, a very practical and real-life situation would be measuring someone's heart rate, for example, from a patient before an exercise session in sitting versus supine position. So if you want to make a comparison, make sure that you never compare a measurement of someone in lying position, supine position, versus upright, because you would expect a difference in heart rate, not because of a true difference in heart rate, but simply because of a difference in stroke volume that can be attributed to the effect of gravity. So always keep this in mind if you want to make a comparison, because gravity definitely has a significant impact on the venous return. Here you can see again a table that we also showed in a previous video where you see normal values. So my message again here is please know your numbers. A good physio should always know what is a average resting heart rate, what is the heart rate during any submaximal intensity, and what is someone's heart rate that I can expect for maximal intensities. Right here again you can see heart rate multiplied by stroke volume should give you cardiac output. And in this table, we included the comparison between rest and maximum values, whereas maximum heart rate, for example, for a 30-year-old person would be expected as 190 beats per minute. If that person would have a stroke volume of 150 beats per minute maximally, this person can reach a cardiac output of close to 30 liters per minute. At rest, those values are significantly lower because both stroke volume is lower as well as resting heart rate is lower. All right, so that completed another video. So I really hope you like it. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.